And hello, Zinnia.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good.
I believe you're in London, not in Sydney. So just for listeners, for those who aren't really aware of who Zinnia is, she was born in Sydney but is now based in London. She's an impact entrepreneur, change agent, and founder of The Dotted Line, a sustainability, diversity and inclusion consultancy working globally with investors, founders and leaders. She's recognised by Vogue India as one of the most influential global Indians in 2019, but she's also a published scientist in human evolutionary psychology and ecology and an accredited ecologist and conservation biologist. That's a lot of ists, isn't it? Very, very clever. Her work addresses sustainability and environmental impacts and addresses the circulatory manufacturing, fashion and business practices. And if that doesn't keep her busy enough, she's a model too, and a face of H&M, Off-White, and of course she's worked for Dior, Chanel and Vogue. So Zinnia, it is absolutely wonderful to have you with us here at Vogue Codes and with our audience this evening. I know you're now working on a documentary film and you write. You're a fashion model. What do you do in your spare time? I want to know. We're looking forward to hearing you speak now, and I'll join you straight afterwards for a short Q&A. So please, I encourage everyone to put their questions in the chat box for Zinnia. Thank you, Zinnia.
Thank you. Should I just begin then?
Absolutely. It's all yours.
Okay, awesome. So what I wanted to talk about today was kind of the politics of beauty, the modern origins, and how we perceive and the implicit biases that come into the way we perceive beauty today. So first of all, beauty is a construct of power. So during a time when European colonizers subjugated much of the world, a method for self-asserting self-superiority and power was through creating a law, or rather a hierarchy of superiority based on appearance, melanin, pigmentation, facial and body features. And the beauty default at the top of this hierarchy was a type called a Nordic type, whose light hair and eyes were located in Northern and Western Europe. And so when non-European pigmented people, much of the people that had been colonized, were measured against this standard, they always came up short. So they were outcast and rejected and placed in an out group. Thus, political constructs of power led to our greatest levels of marginalization and discrimination towards those who most physically varied from this default European construction of beauty. And colonial ideas of white supremacy were backed by biased scientists and scholars, performing pseudoscientific studies in fields such as race, eugenics, and physiognomy, which is the study of facial features. And eugenics is the study of genes and superiority of races. It's a very strange pseudoscience. But the problem was all of these sciences were plagued with confirmation bias from the white European male scientist who performed these studies in a way to uphold his original racist views. So none of these studies stand up to modern scientific rigor, but they still kind of affect the way we view and perceive beauty today. So because science does not live in a vacuum, its interpretation will always be bound by the social and political motivations and climate of the society it was based in. And this became widespread across all of science in the 19th and early 20th century, because this was the view held by most scientists. So, of course, we now know that all humans are the same in capability and quality, and that skin color is a function of a level of pigment in response to UV radiation. So the greater the pigment, the greater the UV protection and the darker the color. And the less the pigment, the more transparent the skin, allowing more UV rays, resulting in lighter skin color. And people have adapted these different colors in different parts of the world. So to this day, we live, feel and experience repercussions, discrimination, marginalization, inferiority complexes, which were proliferated during the era of enlightenment in the 19th and 20th centuries. So today I'm going to explain how the historic scientific biases still control beauty and how this implicitly still marginalizes and discriminates living, breathing people today, and how it did so historically. So how can we collectively overcome this leftover implicit bias and make our media and fashion industries that we work in more inclusive? So first, I want to go back into the history a little bit. So the root behind race science. So the major problem of race science and eugenics was that pigment and facial features that most varied from the Nordic default were ascribed the most inferior and negative traits. So these created these social dichotomies of race. So it created an us versus them, a default versus other, a superior versus an inferior, civilized versus savage, beautiful like us and ugly like them. And I guess by extension, we kind of know this as the way we normalize a certain group, and then we also call another group BIPOC. So that's one example of how it exists today. But there was a political motive to these dichotomies that was created in the 19th and 20th, and by extension, the 18th century as well. The less human and different you could convince society that a particular group was, the more other they were, the more you could justify inhumane treatment of that group. For example, slavery, discrimination, segregation, exhibiting people in zoos, and eradication of their particular culture. And I have a particular case study that I want to share with you, and it's from a German scientist, Dr. Eugene Fischer, in 1905, who created a box that directly relates to these dichotomies. His perception of attractiveness as a function of whiteness and the apparent eugenic racial superiority of certain groups were extrapolated into this particular box. So the meaning of the colors in the middle of the box, which you'll see soon, were the most desirable, and the textures and colors on the ends were considered the least attractive and worthy of being alive. So disturbingly, Fischer used the very same marker to measure the whiteness and racial superiority of Namibians in 1908. And unfortunately, he used this method to systematically kill 3/4 of the population who he deemed racially inferior by the standards of desirable whiteness set out in his trait. So there is an element of genuine discrimination and danger to life as well that comes from these kind of dichotomous perceptions of beauty. And in the box set you'll see, you'll note that there's red hair present as well. And this is because there was a historic persecution of red-haired Irish and Scottish people who were regarded as inferior humans and used as forced indentured labor across the British colonies. And what I wanted to illustrate with this particular case is that people with dark textured hair and red hair were persecuted and marginalized. And both groups still today face some level of discrimination because of their hair, precisely because of the work of scientists like Fischer. And what I really wanted to highlight through this talk and the examples is that this restrictive Eurocentric ideal of beauty was created and reinforced by science, which aimed to maintain power and physical supremacy by excluding and discriminating against most of the world. So physiognomy was this pseudoscience study of reading facial and body features, and what today we regard as ethnic were considered inferior, ugly, and negative by these European scientists who compared the world's people to a singular white supremacist standard that they'd set before, the Nordic standard, which I'd mentioned earlier. And these justifications were very bizarre, actually. So they all backed complete evidence. And some of the justifications, which you'll see soon, is that curly-haired people apparently had the least mental capability for no other reason than having curly hair. And that those with wavy hair textures were leaders of the world, and they couldn't justify why that was. So anything was used in a pseudoscientific sense to justify the European self as superior. And here are some examples of othering that I wanted to go through. So these are from textbooks on physiognomy based in 1897 to 1920. And what's really interesting about this is that they were available in medical literature till the 1970s. And what we can see here, if you look at the first picture, is degrees of intelligence applied based on how different the person looked to the default standard. And also ethnic features such as dorsal humps found throughout the Middle East, Central and South Asia were considered deceitful, whilst typically European noses were considered sincere. And of course, I'd like to think this is kind of like stopped in the world that we live in, but unfortunately, these biased ideas of beauty originating from these histories have not gone away. And in the 21st century, here are some examples of modern children's school textbooks which exhibit this implicit bias. And do you see a similarity between the physiognomic sciences from the turn of the century to the way these implicit biases are being shown today. And I think the main problem is that these dichotomies of superior, beautiful, and deserving of humane treatment versus inferior, ugly, and deserving of inhumane treatment still exist today, whether by implicit or explicit capacity. So if you think about the minorities in society who are the most marginalized, why you find a particular facial feature ugly and which people does it traditionally belong to, or questions like who makes up our parliament, or which group is most visible in magazine covers, you start to see this pattern of implicit pro-European bias, whether by features or color, which has remained for more than 150 years. And also at the turn of the century, when beauty globalized out of Europe, at the time when all of these ideas were floating around, higher degrees of melanin, pigmentation, textured hair, and non-white facial features became considered unattractive. And marketers realized at the time, quite early on, that they could actively exploit the desire for marginalized people to fit into the set standard that they were presented by for example, highlighting the importance of light skin and thus creating colorism. And in order to overcome that, selling skin bleachers. Another example would be highlighting the importance of smooth hair, thus creating hairism and thus selling relaxers and hair extensions for people who didn't have those hair types. So beauty marketing still plays a part in identity issues in particularly non-white communities. There's a disparity of imagery and visual culture versus the actual identities. It varies quite a lot. So these populations are still sometimes subjected to unrealistic standards, a lack of representation. And an example is erasure of native South Asian features that goes back into this idea of physiognomy and race science, such as hyperpigmentation and deep tear troughs, which would be considered unattractive by those previous standards, which has kind of still percolated into society today. And right now, whenever these features are seen in the natural population, instead of seeing the natural beauty, they're associated with a source of shame, which continuously gets exploited by an aesthetics-driven industry to sell cures and belonging through these implicit European white ideals. So these factors have led to intergeneration identity issues. For example, if your grandmother was discriminated against for her hair or skin tone, naturally she would relay this to her daughter. And she would relay the importance of smooth hair and light skin to her daughter, who would then pass those messages to her daughter. In this way, ideals become ingrained over generations, initially to avoid real-life discrimination and disadvantage. But over time, that's how they become created. And what I wanted to talk about was how these kind of histories also affect the modern casting dichotomies. So these biases stemming from these histories can also be found in casting practices today across TV, film, print, and digital media. For example, when you think about Disney characters, and the example I'm going to give is the live action animated version of the Disney film Aladdin. The protagonists' facial features were more European and the antagonists were more ethnic, sending this implicit message that negative characters were ethnicized and placed in this outgroup, whilst positive, virtuous characters were Europeanized through this idea of physiognomy and placed in this social in-group, creating these unrealistic expectations of virtuous whiteness in populations that were unable to reach it. And this extends out to who we have traditionally considered supermodels and why there have been so few with ethnic facial features. Is it our bias of beauty and perception that comes into play? And these are some questions that we really need to ask ourselves and answer. And another example I'm going to give is that these remnants of eugenics, physiognomy, and hierarchies of whiteness and privilege still exist in the perception and representation of beauty, particularly when it comes to the media and fashion industry. So, for example, degrees of whiteness still linked to degrees of beauty, desirableness, and career progression. So a 2017 study found that people find mixed race European faces more attractive than single race ethnic faces. So there is a degree of whiteness stemming from this hysterical race science which controls beauty today. And in the context of South Asians, so these are people from India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, models in the past 5 years of mixed race European descent have had faster, higher career trajectories than those of single race origin. And the same applies for Asian mixed race models too. So this also traditionally, until recently, also applied to African American representation. So an element of privilege and whiteness still applies to casting practices, where those with single race features, despite being more reminiscent and accessible to the wider population that they belong to, will not be selected because their features have not yet been decolonized in the sense of the beauty industry. So this leads to representation of single race features that are still being placed in this restrictive outgroup, as they were once placed by racist scientists in the 1900s. And so therefore they haven't transpired in the modern mind as attractive yet, until of course we change this. Though I would say that the only group that has progressed quite far in terms of this type of representation is due to fierce campaigning, is single race Black African descent representation. However, this has not necessarily extended out to other groups, for example, South Asians, East Asians, Middle East, and South American representation just yet, but we can change that. So we have been conditioned over this long period of time to think about and normalize implicit racial biases. So how can we as individuals in society change, challenge, and gain awareness and unlearn some of these subconscious biases that inform the way we perceive beauty and other people? So the first way would be to recognize our own biases. So we need to question why we find something attractive or unattractive, and have a think about where we might have learned this. Because if we dig deep enough, we find that we have been affected by these implicit biases over time. And the other part I wanted to talk about was identity, beauty, and perception. So ideas of attractiveness, identity, and belonging are not created in vacuum. They are created by media messages and representation you receive from childhood. So there is the desired social in-group ascribed positive traits, which you might have got from watching movies. And the comparative out-group, this marginalized, discriminated group, ascribed negative traits. So there are ideals of beauty that are also passed on intergenerationally from real-life experiences of our grandparents and ancestors, which I mentioned previously. So it is important to start to re-examine how and why we think beauty and the way we ascribe negative or positive traits to something exists. And the most powerful instigator of identity, belonging, and acceptance of facial features that vary from the socially omnipresent norm is through increasing representation. To see more people with very distinctive ethnic features, which were traditionally invisible, is very important, because what we view most often becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar becomes average, and this becomes attractive. For example, in the last 3 years, the rise of African descent model visibility in high fashion has done an amazing job of creating repeated exposure to all of Western society, resulting in widespread acceptance and acknowledgement of African descent beauty. However, I can't say the same exists for other groups such as Middle Eastern and South Asian women who still have such low levels of representation. And this actually leads to another major problem. So there is this huge problem in society that arises when you don't represent diverse range of features and racial individuals in the media. So not only is this problematic to childhood identity, belonging, representation in minority communities, it creates an implicit racial psychological phenomenon called the other race effect, which happens when you don't see individuals of another race represented, particularly in single race format, when you mentally can't tell the differences of features apart. So what sometimes happens is people make ignorant and racist assumptions that all people of a particular group look the same. But luckily there is a way of overcoming this, and it's simply to see more people of a group or race. And that's how you can break the system of the other race effect. And it's because it's from a system that didn't represent a range of races and faces and features in the media. And I think a lot of the responsibility of this can come down to casting and agency responsibility, because I think the greatest immediate changes that can come from ensuring racial and ethnic diversity at the agency level, our talent and modeling agencies across the country are still heavily dominated by European ancestry talent. Though there has been a recent spike in Black African descent representation, these agencies have still fringe representation of other races and groups from across the world. For example, Black and white peoples only make up 25% of the world's population, meaning 75% of the world's people are completely unrepresented in the fashion and media sector, especially featuring people with typically unrepresented features, which I've talked about previously, which were considered unattractive by the standards of physiognomy. So the thing is, clients are after diversity and inclusion. So there is no excuse not to represent more people from different regions with different features. Maybe we just have to change our perspective of what we find beautiful and expand that in order to become more exclusive. And furthermore, to that, I believe racial representation is a precursor for inclusivity, as secondary traits such as sexuality, ability, size, gender, and height, religion can be found in people from across the world. However, when racial and ancestral representation is omitted in favor of representing people from one or two groups with a multitude of these secondary traits, as has been the recent trend, this, in my eyes, is not conscious inclusivity because it still creates the problem of the other race effect. And I mean, these are some ways and examples. I don't have that much time, but yes, I wanted to give some examples of how we as people can really question our own biases, find out why we think things are the way they are, and how we as a people in a group can change the way we view others in a more positive light, and how we can destigmatize, decolonize the way beauty and perception has been seen across the world over, the last 120 years. And I personally hope that Australia, I think Australia has this wonderful position right now. It has the potential to become the world's most multicultural represented country. So, I mean, we call ourselves a multicultural country, but I think it would be just incredible to be one of the forerunners in the world, to be representative in that way as well. And I think it's really important to note that recognizing bias is not easy. It is something that we have to work on ourselves, because it challenges the way we think, not just on a conscious level, but also on a subconscious level. And it's a collective effort. If we can recognize the disadvantage and discrimination other people have faced through their life and their histories, we can really create and improve well-being and belonging for all people. So I think this is a collective effort we can all get in on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zinnia. That's absolutely fascinating. And I know you pose many difficult problems that we all need to tackle. I've got some really great questions that have come in from you, from the readers. But I thought I'd start off with one that says, have you personally experienced the effects of colorism as a model?
Yes, I have. And I have experienced it under two very different circumstances. So one where I was personally discriminated, not because of my skin color, but because of my race. So I wasn't accessible. This is a couple of years ago now. I wasn't accessible to the Australian agency sector because of my race not being a part white Indian model. And because of that, my features and all that couldn't be seen or accepted in that way. And in terms of colorism, I have experienced colorism actually. And I remember this because I was shooting with this particular team and I didn't have a tan at the time. And then 2 weeks later, I went and I ended up getting a tan. And I was told by the makeup artist that I was unattractive and that I've just made myself ugly. And coming from my particular family, which has a range of skin tones, my mom is very, very dark skinned. And seeing the way she was treated by people in society as well really kind of changed the way I viewed colorism, and which is why I started to research colorism, because I was like, this is not something we need to experience. Why should we be discriminated against for something we can't change?
Another question from Christina. How do you deal with self-doubt?
I have a lot of self-doubt personally. I'm just going to be honest with you. I just push through it. I'm just like, well, we can just kind of get over it. Everything's a bump. And I think self-doubt comes from a place of challenging our comfort zone as well. So whenever I feel self-doubt, I feel like that's a moment for me to really challenge that feeling and really kind of push through it.
Speaking of challenging yourself, I've got a question here about, what you love most about what you do, but I'd like to add to Laura's question by asking you, how do you combine the things you do, modelling, and you're interested in fashion, obviously, but also your scientific background and your study. Like, how did those two things come about, and how do you feel about connecting almost the two, and which parts do you enjoy most? Being in front of the camera or...
I think this is really, I find this quite, I guess the way I would answer this is my original background was I was 4 when I decided I wanted to be a scientist. So that was kind of like a given for me. I was like, this is something I really want to do. And as I was studying it, I realized there was so many science questions that were informed by my work as a model as well, because having this dualistic perspective really kind of gives you this almost unlimited view of how the world works and how different ideas are created. And that's kind of how I came up with this idea of thought where actually the beauty industry is also informed by science, and science is also informed by the beauty industry. So I think there's an illusion of things being separate, but everything's kind of really interlinked. And if you find the ways to link them together, you can actually do it. You just have to think outside the box a bit.
Well, I think that leads to another question we have here that's come in that says, do you have any advice for someone currently in university hoping to pursue a career in multiple diverse fields, which is exactly what you've done?
I think that the world that we currently live in versus the world that everyone's going to live in the next 10 to 15 years is going to need people from these very diverse backgrounds, because the point at which great innovation comes from is that interdisciplinary area when you combine two completely different fields, for example, art and science, fashion with science as well. And that is where these new insights that no one has ever thought of comes from. And I personally think if you follow your passions, what will naturally happen is you'll find that space, because there's a lot of dogma in the world as well that kind of binds us to different fields and the way we think about those fields. So as soon as we kind of unlock that, we kind of realize that everything's really fluid and kind of interlinks with each other.
Another one here. Do you think the Australian fashion industry is starting to move in the right direction in terms of casting more diverse models? I mean, I know you're in London at the moment, so it's probably hard to recent opinion, but...
So I think in terms of casting, there has been a great change for an increase in representation and inclusion. And I know, just chatting with Edwina myself, that Vogue wants people from these diverse backgrounds, but the main problem is we can't find them. So I think the main controls of these, the gatekeepers for inclusion, is actually model agencies. And until they start to be more inclusive and include people from different groups that have not had traditional representation, we're not going to see them. Because if they're not represented, how can we use them and employ them? And how will they be able to go overseas and work overseas as well? So I think I'm going to put the blame here on the agencies. Sorry, guys, but I feel like you need to be a bit more inclusive. One, Middle Eastern model on your board is just not good enough.
Well, I hope there are some young women looking at this now who think they should come forward, because I do believe that a little bit of self-doubt and feeling you may be rejected may be one of the reasons we're not seeing as many models come through. Perhaps they're also not coming forward to model agencies, turning up on the door, if you like, in the way that many models have. So I guess, do you see yourself as a role model? Would you like to sort of be a mentor? Do you hope that your presence, your success in the fashion industry, but also your successful career with science as well, is going to attract more women into believing that they can play a role in changing opinions and changing the way we perceive beauty?
I hope so, because I guess when I started this field, there was these huge stereotypes for, a scientist looks like this, a model looks like this, she can't think, she is like this. And I think the last couple of years, as a global culture, we've kind of become a little bit more inclusive and a bit more feminist to the way we see women and the way we kind of perceive their qualities, because not everything is about the way we look or not everything is about the label we've been given. We can actually, we're so much more than that. And I think that's what's really, really important here, because this platform gives me the opportunity to speak and kind of destigmatize and decolonize a lot of these ideas that I've personally experienced from these two industries. And I hope that I can create some kind of positive change that the next generation after me can really like take advantage of and take somewhere else to to the next level, because I think it's still quite baby steps what I'm talking about here and how it's kind of come to the mind of people, because it's, I guess, quite a new thing. It's only 2020, but we do need more progress in that way. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but...
Oh, absolutely. I think that's interesting, actually, that you say you've experienced stigma in both industries, being science as well, given that the whole purpose of Vogue Codes is to engage more young women in the areas of technology, but science as well. Do you think there is still a problem in the science industry in general regarding women and them feeling that there's a place for them, particularly at the R&D table?
I definitely think there is a problem in science with particularly women, especially when you see women who are progressing through their careers in between the ages of 30s and 40s. There's this huge exodus of research women out of science during this period of time. And that's because a lot of these environments are not inclusive to the lifestyles women want to lead. For example, if they have children, they're still expected to work like they didn't have a child. And so it ends up being, in an implicit way, favoring of men and male members of the scientific industry, which might be a reason why there are so many male professors versus female professors, and why so many tenure track positions are not held by females. But I think this question needs more exploration, because there's so many elements to it.
Well, Zinnia, Kumar, you inspire us and you challenge us to be better and to think differently and to really challenge our perceptions, not only of beauty, but women in science too. So I thank you so much for your keynote today and for leading so many discussions in this area. Zinnia is also now a permanent fixture at Vogue Australia as an advisor, not only featuring in our pages, but also as an advisor around diversity and keeping us honest and keeping us on track to make sure that we are fully committed to better outcomes. So Zinnia, thank you so much for tonight, but also for your support of Vogue Australia and helping guide us into a new world and on different ways. And thank you to everyone who has joined us at Vogue Code Lives to watch Zinnia speak today.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure talking with you all. So yeah, let's change this together, everyone.